There is a brutal truth about extreme success that very few people are willing to confront. You can spend years building an empire with your own hands. You can sacrifice your youth, your relationships, and your sanity for a single vision, and even after creating something that changes the world, it can still be taken away from you in an instant. Success does not guarantee security. Sometimes it simply raises the height from which you can fall. Imagine a 30-year-old visionary sitting alone in a silent office. The room that once buzzed with admiration now feels hollow and unfamiliar. Just hours earlier, he had been the center of a global revolution. Now he stares at the walls, realizing the executives he personally hired have just forced him out. The empire he created has rejected him. Not long ago, he was celebrated as a prodigy, the young rebel who dared to challenge an entire industry and win. Magazine covers praised his brilliance. Investors trusted his instincts. Engineers followed his vision with near-religious devotion. Yet in one ruthless moment, that image shattered, leaving behind a disgraced founder stripped of authority and identity. The momentum crashed. The betrayal was absolute. The board voted. The CEO turned his back. Allies fell silent. In a single afternoon, everything he built slipped beyond his reach. The company remained. The products remained. The vision remained. But he no longer belonged to any of it. What makes this moment truly devastating is not the business loss. It is the psychological vacuum. When your entire identity is fused with one creation, losing it feels like losing yourself. The mission that once defined every waking hour suddenly disappears, leaving behind a suffocating void of uncertainty. For many people, this level of rejection would end the story. Pride would collapse into bitterness. Confidence would rot into regret. Yet somehow this catastrophic humiliation did not destroy the man at the center of it. Instead, it became the exact pressure required to reshape him into something far greater. Because the disgraced founder sitting in that empty room would one day return, stronger, wiser, and more dangerous than before. And the failure that nearly erased his name would become the foundation of his legend. This is the story of Steve Jobs and the failure that made him legendary. Before the world knew him as a disciplined icon of innovation, he was something far more volatile, brilliant, obsessive, and fiercely ambitious, yet also impulsive and arrogant. The mythology that later surrounded him often erased this early truth. In reality, he was a young man convinced that ordinary limits simply did not apply to him, and for a while, the world seemed to prove him right. The success arrived with dizzying speed. A company born inside a modest garage suddenly exploded into a technological revolution. Apple's machines began reshaping how people interacted with computers, and the young co-founder at the center of it all became unimaginably wealthy before most people finished college. Fame, influence, and fortune arrived almost overnight. That kind of rapid ascent distorts reality. When your ideas repeatedly succeed against impossible odds, it becomes easy to believe your instincts are infallible. Jobs began to see himself not just as a founder, but as a force of nature, someone whose vision was so powerful that disagreement felt like incompetence. In his mind, compromise became the enemy of greatness. This belief fueled a ruthless perfectionism. He demanded products that felt magical, elegant, and revolutionary, but the pursuit of perfection often came at a brutal human cost. Engineers were pushed past exhaustion. Meetings turned into psychological battlegrounds. Praise was rare, criticism was relentless, and many talented employees left feeling emotionally scorched. At the center of this intensity was something his colleagues would later call the reality distortion field. Jobs possessed an uncanny ability to bend perception. He could persuade teams that impossible deadlines were achievable and convince investors that revolutionary ideas were inevitable. This gift helped create groundbreaking products, yet it also strained nearly every relationship around him. Then came the decision that would quietly reshape the future of Apple. Jobs recruited a polished executive from Pepsi named John Sculley. It seemed like a brilliant move at the time. A visionary founder pairing with an experienced corporate leader. But beneath the surface, their philosophies could not have been more different. Jobs believed Apple existed to challenge the world through radical creativity. The board believed Apple needed discipline, structure, and predictable profits. Caught between those forces was a young founder who understood innovation deeply but had not yet learned the fragile art of leadership. And the storm gathering inside Apple was already beginning to form. By the mid-1980s, the pressure surrounding Apple was becoming impossible to ignore. The Macintosh had arrived with enormous excitement, praised for its elegance and bold vision. Yet behind the glowing headlines, the numbers told a far less comforting story. Sales struggled to match expectations, expenses continued to climb, and investors began whispering that Apple's momentum might already be fading. Inside the company, a deeper conflict was unfolding. On one side stood Steve Jobs, the fiery architect who believed technology should be art, something beautiful enough to change human culture. On the other side stood John Sculley, the disciplined executive who understood that a company must satisfy markets, shareholders, and financial reality. Vision collided with stability, and neither man was willing to bend. As the tension escalated, the workplace atmosphere began to fracture. Jobs drove his teams relentlessly, demanding brilliance and dismissing anything less. Departments competed instead of cooperating. Engineers felt caught between inspiration and exhaustion. What once felt like a revolutionary mission slowly started to resemble a battlefield of egos and conflicting agendas. The board of directors watched carefully as the chaos intensified. At first, they tolerated Jobs' intensity because it had fueled Apple's early magic. But as financial pressure mounted, their patience began to evaporate. Quiet conversations started shifting in tone. The founder they once admired was gradually being reclassified as a dangerous risk to the company's survival. Sensing the ground slipping beneath him, Jobs made a desperate decision. Rather than negotiate, he planned a bold internal coup. His idea was simple and reckless: gather enough support inside the boardroom to remove Sculley from power and reclaim full control of Apple. It was a move driven by instinct, pride, and the belief that his vision alone could save the company. But the plan did not remain secret for long. Word of the maneuver leaked through the executive corridors, reaching Sculley before the strategy could take shape. What followed was an explosive confrontation inside Apple's leadership circle. Allegiances were forced into the open. Directors who once praised Jobs now demanded a clear choice between chaos and stability. The final decision arrived with brutal clarity. The board sided with Sculley. Steve Jobs was stripped of his operational authority and removed from the teams he once commanded. Officially, he still held a title, but it meant almost nothing. Isolated from power, he was moved to a quiet office far from the center of Apple's activity, a place he bitterly called Siberia. In 1985, the final chapter of his downfall arrived quietly. There was no triumphant farewell, no ceremony, no celebration of the man who helped ignite the personal computer revolution. Just a slow walk out of the building he once ruled. Each step toward the parking lot carried a heavy realization: he was no longer part of the world he had created. The humiliation quickly spread beyond Apple's walls. Newspapers, magazines, and television analysts began dissecting the dramatic collapse. The narrative was ruthless. The once celebrated prodigy was now portrayed as a reckless visionary whose own ego had destroyed his career. In the public eye, he had become a cautionary tale instead of a hero. For Jobs, the pain was deeper than professional loss. Apple had never been just a company. It was his identity, his life's work, the embodiment of everything he believed about technology and creativity. Without it, he felt strangely hollow. The question echoed constantly in his mind: if I am not Apple, then who am I? At first, anger filled the void. He blamed the board, the executives, and especially Sculley for what he saw as betrayal. The bitterness was sharp and consuming. Yet as the weeks passed, a quieter realization began to surface. Beneath the politics and power struggles, his own arrogance had played a dangerous role in the disaster. The months that followed felt like wandering through a wilderness. Jobs traveled, met with old friends, and spent long stretches alone in his large, empty house. Days passed without the adrenaline of product launches or boardroom battles. Instead, there was silence, reflection, and the slow process of confronting the person he had become. In that silence, something unexpected began to happen. The larger-than-life persona of the untouchable genius started to crumble. The humiliation had stripped away the illusion that brilliance alone guaranteed success. What remained was a man forced to examine his flaws with brutal honesty, something he had rarely done before. Eventually, a painful but powerful truth settled in. Vision and intelligence were not enough to sustain greatness. Without patience, humility, and emotional discipline, even the brightest ideas could collapse under their own weight. The exile that once felt like the end of his story was quietly preparing him for a transformation he could not yet see. The turning point did not arrive with applause or sudden clarity. It emerged slowly, after months of reflection and frustration. At some point, Steve Jobs stopped replaying the betrayal in his mind. The blame began to lose its grip. Instead of asking why the board had removed him, he started asking a far more uncomfortable question: what had he done to create that outcome? This shift was subtle but powerful. For the first time, he accepted that his own behavior had contributed to the collapse, the arrogance, the volatility, the relentless pressure he placed on others. Rather than defending the old version of himself, he chose to confront it. That decision marked the beginning of real transformation. With the burden of defending his past slowly dissolving, something unexpected replaced it, a sense of lightness. For years, he had carried the crushing weight of being the golden boy of Silicon Valley. Every move had to prove his genius. Now that reputation was gone. Strangely, losing it felt liberating. Freed from the pressure of maintaining success, he rediscovered something far more important: his love for building things. The board had taken Apple, but they could not take his curiosity, his imagination, or the deep satisfaction he felt when creating technology that felt alive. That passion remained untouched. Instead of retreating from the industry, Jobs made a bold decision. He launched a new company called NEXT Computer. It was not merely another startup. It was his laboratory, a place where he could prove to himself that he had learned from the past and could lead with greater discipline and purpose. Around the same time, he made an even stranger move. He invested in a small, struggling computer graphics division that very few people believed in. The company would eventually be known as Pixar. Entering the world of animated storytelling pushed him far beyond his usual comfort zone and forced him to think in completely new ways. These ventures humbled him in ways Apple never had. Resources were limited, success was uncertain, and survival required patience. Gradually, Jobs began to evolve as a leader. Instead of dominating every decision, he learned to trust talented creators around him, especially the storytellers and animators who were quietly building something magical at Pixar. The road back to relevance was far from glamorous. After leaving Apple, there was no immediate redemption waiting for Steve Jobs. Next Computer launched with bold ambition and stunning design, but the market response was cold. The machines were powerful yet expensive, and sales numbers remained painfully small. The comeback story many expected simply refused to appear. Year after year, the company struggled to find its place. Engineers worked tirelessly to refine the technology, yet the hardware division continued bleeding money. For the younger version of Jobs, this kind of setback might have triggered rage or denial, but now the situation forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth: the strategy itself needed to change. Eventually, Next made a difficult pivot. The company abandoned its elegant hardware and shifted its focus entirely toward software. It was a humbling moment, a quiet admission that the original dream had failed. Yet this flexibility revealed something new about Jobs. The once rigid perfectionist had learned how to adapt instead of simply forcing reality to obey his vision. Meanwhile, Pixar was fighting its own battle for survival. The animation studio consumed enormous amounts of money while producing almost no profit. Jobs continued funding the company from his own fortune, watching millions disappear each year. Many advisors urged him to abandon the experiment before it consumed everything he had left. Then something extraordinary happened. Pixar released a film unlike anything audiences had seen before. Toy Story blended groundbreaking computer animation with deeply human storytelling. The movie became a cultural phenomenon, proving that technology and creativity together could reshape an entire industry. For Jobs, it was a powerful validation of his evolving philosophy. While Pixar soared, Apple was slowly collapsing. Without a clear visionary direction, the company had drifted into confusion. Too many products, too little innovation, and a growing sense that the once revolutionary brand had lost its soul. By the mid-1990s, Apple was teetering dangerously close to bankruptcy. In a twist that felt almost poetic, the struggling giant made a desperate move to survive. Apple decided to purchase Next for its advanced operating system, but the deal carried an unexpected consequence. Along with the technology came the very man they had once exiled. When Steve Jobs walked back onto the Apple campus, he returned not as the reckless founder they removed, but as a battle-tested leader ready for a second act. Rock bottom has a strange kind of power. When everything collapses, when reputation, status, and certainty are stripped away, what remains is the raw foundation of a person's character. For Steve Jobs, that devastating fall from Apple was not the end of his journey. It was the necessary fire that reshaped his thinking, his leadership, and his understanding of what true success required. Years later, he would describe life through a simple but profound idea, connecting the dots. Looking backward, the painful detours suddenly formed a pattern. Next's software architecture would later become the backbone of Apple's future operating systems. Pixar would teach him how technology and storytelling could merge into emotional experiences that people loved. Those experiences became the invisible blueprint behind Apple's greatest creations: the elegant simplicity of the iMac, the revolutionary design of the iPod, and eventually the transformative impact of the iPhone all carried traces of lessons learned during the years he spent away from the company he once lost. Failure had quietly rewritten his philosophy of innovation. Rejection often feels personal, as if it permanently defines your value. But history repeatedly shows something different. In many cases, rejection is not a verdict on your potential. It is a brutal recalibration, a force that pushes you toward the environment where your strengths can evolve and mature. The hardest part of that transformation is enduring the silent years. The seasons when recognition disappears and progress feels invisible. Jobs survived nearly a decade in that wilderness, building companies, facing doubts, and slowly reconstructing his confidence without knowing if redemption would ever come. This is the difference between ordinary success and legendary greatness. Talent can create a breakthrough, but resilience is what allows someone to rise again after humiliation, rebuild their vision, and shape a legacy that outlives the temporary failures of their past. If you are walking through your own wilderness right now, do not stop. Subscribe to success stories to build your resilience. Remember, your greatest failure might just be the prologue to your legacy.